Our session for the next hour is about weather, climate and international development. And I think it is going to be fascinating for a number of reasons, three of which are that climate change is perhaps the biggest humanitarian challenge for humanity that we face, certainly at the moment, probably one of the biggest challenges we've ever faced. What this session is about is how science is applied to this policy problem in a very practical way. So we're going to be looking at some examples from the developing world. And one of the features of climate change is that those of us in countries that produce the most carbon emissions are unlikely to be those that are the most directly or worst affected. So the countries around the world that are producing relatively small carbon emissions per capita are those that are most directly affected. So as an issue, this is one that touches on so many aspects of policy making and evidence. And what each of the speakers today is going to do is talk about how they worked in partnership with governments and with communities in countries around the world. And we're looking particularly at Africa. And the other reason I think this is going to be a fascinating hour is because of the calibre of our speakers. I'll introduce each of our speakers as they come up to the podium and give a very short session, because what we're very keen to do is make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And I hope we can allow at least 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the four quite short presentations. We also have a short video. But we have two speakers from the Met Office who have organised this session today, and we also have distinguished speakers from the Department of Energy and Climate Change and the Department for International Development. And so without further ado, I will invite Nafis Mir from the Department for International Development to kick us, from DEC, Department of Energy and Climate Change, to kick us off. Today. Now, Nafis is Head of Science at the Department of Energy and Climate Change, previously at DEFRA, and is going to talk to us about international climate policy, a very fraught area. And somehow, I'm not quite sure how, but Nafis in his spare time is a barrister. So, Nafis, would you like to come and get us started? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and welcome to everybody, and good afternoon. I've got 5 minutes. It's a very short period of time to squeeze quite a lot of information in, so I'll try to just pick on the kind of key points. What I'd like to do over the next 5 minutes or so is give you a quick overview of where DEC is coming from in this space, in particular on low-carbon development. Now, a little bit of background about DEC. We recently went through an exercise, like most of you have gone through in other departments, of trying to define, following the CSR and business planning, and through a business planning process, what we're about. And you can't fault us for the lack of ambition. Our purpose is to power the country and protect the planet, and we've got two risks that we exist to counter. The first is dangerous climate change, and the second is to avoid the risk of a shortfall of affordable supplies of energy. Now, what I want to do is focus on the first of these risks and what we're doing about that. Now, what this shows you is the magnitude of the challenge of avoiding dangerous climate change. This graph shows you the greenhouse gas emissions and the rate at which they have to come down very, very quickly. This is going to be a huge challenge to peak and then strongly decline thereafter. And we have to do this if we want to keep the global average temperature rise to less than 2 degrees. Now, a lot of people were disappointed at Copenhagen and the outcome of Copenhagen. I think, and the general consensus is, that Cancun was a relative success. There are a number of key things that were agreed at Cancun. First of all, that emissions should peak to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees, which was formally agreed for the first time. Recognize that sustainable development is an overriding priority for developing countries. And more importantly, it agreed for specific mechanisms, the Green Climate Fund, the technology mechanisms, adaptation framework, and lastly, this registry for mitigation action. And Also, it agreed substantial amounts of finance, a fast-track finance of 30 billion by 2012, and a commitment to up to 100 billion by 2020 in the Climate Fund. Now, the UK is making a significant, important contribution to this, certainly the Fast Track Fund, and it has set up an international climate fund, which is jointly managed by DFID, DEC, and DEFRA. One of the things we're particularly interested in terms of priorities is to build this, demonstrate that it is feasible to build a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy, get that growth at scale. And also, it's important to provide support for adaptation in developing countries. Now, where does science come into this? Well, climate science in particular, is going to play a very crucial role, because one of the things that we do need to be able to do is predict regional climate change, and that's in order to help countries plan investments, both in their kind of energy infrastructure and also in terms of adaptation. We'll need climate observations and early warning systems. The experience of what's happening in the Horn of Africa is a case in point where climate variability is something that we need to understand a lot better. And linked to that is the frequency of extreme weather events. Last year, you'll all remember the droughts in Pakistan and in Russia. One of the things that the climate science is saying is that these extreme events are going to be more frequent in the future, and we need to understand a lot more about that phenomenon and the frequency. Linked to that is the tipping points in various systems, particularly the agricultural and water systems, which are going to affect developing countries very, very adversely. And we need to understand where those particular tipping points are. And finally, it's all very well being in a position where you give knowledge, impart knowledge and transfer technology, but it's very important also, and this is also part of this program, that there is scientific and technical capacity that is built in developing countries, so they can understand what the issues are for themselves and be able to address that on a kind of equal partnership basis. Now, I'll stop there. There's a Q&A session, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Nafis. As I say, more from Nafis a little bit later on. Next, I'm going to ask Ivan Bio from Department for International Development to come and talk to us. Ivan is the head of climate change and research at the Department for International Development. Great deal of experience there and in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. He also taught, but quite some time ago, I ought to say, at the University of East Anglia, and not climate change. But you have that experience as well, and I'm sure you're still in touch with people there.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit about a small program we support in DFID. On the application of science in development. Nafis has just talked to you about how our government, through the ICF, the International Climate Fund, is attempting to support developing countries to move to low-carbon development pathways, to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change, and to help them combat deforestation. And most of that funding, actually all the funding for the moment, is overseas development assistance. It's classified as overseas development assistance. And this is, we believe, right and proper, because climate and climate change have a profound impact on poor people's lives in developing countries. A recent report, for instance, by the UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction reported that if you're a poor person living in a developing country, you're 225 times more likely to die from a cyclone than people in rich countries. They also mentioned that exposure to cyclones and exposure to flooding is increasing dramatically. And thirdly, they're also saying that the ability for developing countries to bounce back from disasters, especially for the poorest country, that ability is eroding fairly rapidly. Now, the other thing that we know is that it is quite likely that climate change is not going to make things better. On the contrary, it is likely that the situation is going to get much worse for quite a few people in developing countries. The areas that are featured red and orange and yellow on this map are likely to face increased likelihood of dry conditions. And the areas colored in blue are, we are told, more likely to suffer from increased rainfall and from flooding and disasters related to that. So one of the ways in which DFID is trying to help is by commissioning research that's going to tell developing country people, and especially poor people in developing countries, what they can expect, both in terms of the short term, what's the likelihood of flooding, what's the likelihood of a good or a bad growing season, but also in terms of the long term, what is climate likely going to look like in 20 to 50 years' time. And one of the projects we support is a partnership with the Hadley Centre that goes under the acronym of the CSRP, or Climate Science Research Partnership, which has four main objectives. One is to improve our understanding of what drives climate in Africa, incorporate this understanding in the Hadley climate models to make sure that the accuracy, or rather the reliability of projections of climate and weather can be improved, have a better understanding of the likelihood of a climate change signal in current climate events in Africa, and lastly, to develop and to extend tools that allow local planners and local researchers in developing countries to estimate what is likely to happen on local conditions. Now, early results from this program are rather promising. The improvements that the team in Hadley have made in their models on the basis of the results from this program so far have shown that it is possible to have more reliable predictions of the onset dates of the rainy season. And this is very important for farmers. If they know better or more reliably when rains are likely to start, they can get their seeds and they can get their land preparations in time for that season. And this reliability has improved so much that the Hadley Centre has issued a test warning, early warning, of the likely onset dates for the rainy season, especially in the area of Africa north of the equator. And what they have shown is that it is quite likely that for large parts of West Africa, the rains this year are going to come later than usual. And they have provided this warning to regional meteorological services. What's the potential impact of this kind of work? A number of papers recently have looked at this. One paper in Zimbabwe has shown that farmers who use predictions of onset dates and likely rainfall conditions in the coming growing season, those farmers who use that information are likely to get on average between 10 and 20% better crop production than farmers who don't use this information. And secondly, in Bangladesh, a recent paper also showed that rural people can save up to $130 to $190 per household if they heed warnings that are given of impending flood risks, as long as these warnings are given 10 days before the floods occur. So there are very significant benefits from this kind of science, and there are projects underway to try and extend this knowledge into applications. So what do we conclude from all this? As I said, climate, floods, cyclones, they kill people and they destroy livelihoods. But science can do something about this, and some of the investments that we have and some of the partnerships we have, especially this one with the Hadley Centre, has, I hope, shown an example of how we can make things better. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Ivan. Again, more from Ivan a little bit later on. Our next speaker is from the Met Office. It's Tom Butcher, who's the External Relations Manager at the Met Office. And Tom has always had an interest, I understand, in both meteorology, it's a tricky word to say, and international development. And so to bring those two things together, I think it means you're in the right job. And I think one of the things that might be in the back of your mind is how is this applied? How do people get the communication? And one of the things that Tom's going to talk about is a really superb example of people using this evidence in their daily lives. So thank you, Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. So I'm going to describe a project called the Mobile Weather Alert, which we're piloting in Uganda with fishermen on Lake Victoria. And it's a project that I've been involved with a UN agency called the World Meteorological Organization over the last 12 months. I think this project neatly highlights three key points. The first is that in everything that the Met Office does, not just international development, taking a multidisciplinary and partnership approach is the best way of ensuring both sustainability and usefulness of the products to end user communities. The second point is that as scientists, we need to really accept that there's a big challenge associated with making sure our outputs are relevant and sustainably useful to the communities that they're intended to. And this challenge is almost as big as developing the science itself. And the third point is, I'm going to talk about weather. Climate change adaptation doesn't necessarily mean things that are relevant to people in 20 or 40 years' time. And actually, building people's resilience to today's weather and today's climate can help increase their resilience to future climate change. This gives you an idea of the partners that are involved in the Mobile Weather Alert project. Ericsson and MTN are telecommunications partners. Lake Rescue is a small Ugandan NGO who are concerned with the safety of people in and around the Lake Victoria region. And the key partner really is the Uganda Department of Meteorology. So I'm going to hand over now to a colleague from the Uganda Department of Meteorology, Caleb Mwembi, who's going to describe this project in more detail. Now, can you note that this video was shot by a colleague, so it's not really got BBC polish, if you know what I mean. Can we play the video, please?
The mobile weather alert pilot is basically using of mobile phone text SMS to provide an effective, efficient, and tailor-made weather alert service, especially to specified user community. And in our pilot, we are starting with the fishermen over Lake Victoria. And in all this, our view is to safeguard life and property of the fishermen to some of the dangers which are associated with severe and extreme weather over the lake. The key partners in this initiative are the Department of Meteorology in Uganda, then the World Meteorological Organization, then we also have Ericsson International, then we have MTN, who is the mobile service provider in Uganda, and then we have a non-government organization, the Lake Rescue Institute, which is also providing some support to this mobile weather alert pilot in Uganda. The Met Office has been very, very critical and crucial in the delivery of this project. And in the first, the project realized that it's very important that we have critical training for the forecasters, especially as regards to finding a critical criteria of issuing forecasting. So with that support, the UK Met Office provided an expert in extreme rainfall forecasting, Paul Davis, who has been working very closely with the forecasters on developing the criteria of issuing this forecast. And maybe I would also wish to mention that because of the input of the UK Met Office, we have adopted the color coding system which UK is using in extreme weather alerts. It is our belief that, first of all, receiving this timely, tailor-made weather about the locality of these fishermen is very important, first of all, for information, and then purposely for warning of the impending dangers which may be associated, especially when we experience very severe weather over the lake. We hope that the first biggest achievement for this project is creating more awareness, especially to the fishing community, about the importance of using weather in their day-to-day activities. And as such, this will reduce accidents over the lake, especially accidents which are attributed to bad weather or severe weather. And they will also create, expect that the project will create more trust on the services and information provided by the Met office. And at the end of it all, it will also improve and enhance the integrity of the Meteorological Department of Uganda, especially to other user community.
I love the security guard in the background. He's great. This gives you an idea of just some of the incidents that occurred last year on Lake Victoria, resulting in boats capsizing and lives lost. Lake Rescue have got a lot of experience working with these communities on the lake, and estimate that over 5,000 people get killed each year on Lake Victoria, which is quite a staggering number. Of course, this is a compound issue, and whilst weather's important, and storms and winds are always factors that are important to these boats capsizing, boats are also poorly maintained. You can see from that video. Often the boats are overloaded, and most of the fishermen can't swim. So a compound problem needs a compound solution. And certainly Lake Rescue has been working to provide locally made life jackets to fishermen on the lake and promote better safety. And they're also working to establish a full RNLI type service, rescue service on the lake. But it's better still if people don't get into trouble in the first place. And that's where our project, the Mobile Weather Alert, comes into its own. Just to give you an idea of some of the science and technology that we're translating through this project, as well as the penetration of mobile phones, which has been phenomenal in the East Africa region, and even the most isolated fishing communities people will have access to mobile phones. On the right-hand side, you can see some satellite data from the European club called EUMETSAT, which provide us with satellite information in this region. And this is one of the storms which caused one of the incidents featured in the previous slide. On the left-hand side is the latest model output from the Met Office. And what we've been able to do is run our models over the years at increasingly high resolution as our supercomputers have got bigger and bigger in Exeter. And now we're able to run a model over Lake Victoria that has a resolution that's good enough to capture the tropical storms that develop on the lake and create problems for the fishermen. So this stuff's available now. So there's a challenge in making sure that people like Khaled, the forecasters on the ground, have access to that information. But the other challenge that's just as big is changing the culture within the Met Department and helping them to deliver these new products operationally and increasing expectations across government that they're expecting the Met Department to produce these products is just as big a challenge. And good governance at all levels within the Ugandan government is quite important. And to do this, WMO, and particularly the Met Office, have been working very hard with both the Met Department and also supporting institutions in Uganda. Another challenge is to tailor the forecast to the needs of end users. We know this in the UK. You can have the best forecast in the world, the best prediction in the world, but if you don't communicate that in a way that people can clearly understand and act upon, then it's worthless. So we've done a lot of work with the Uganda Department of Meteorology, Lake Rescue, and the fishing communities themselves to design a way of presenting information, forecast information that's relevant to this community. Khaled in the video mentions this color coding system, and this is relating weather information, the technical information that the forecaster predicts, to a very simple traffic light system that fishing communities can understand. And we've also worked on languages so that it's in a language that people understand as well. So this was the launch in May of the Mobile Weather Alert Service. This is our group of community leaders, and we trained them for a couple of days in May in what does the forecast mean? How could they respond to it? How they respond is their decision, it's up to them, but they're the people who can come up with the ideas about what they can do differently in response to a forecast. And finally, we got these people to recruit another 1,000 people to take part in our pilot, and they've been incredibly successful at that. They're incredibly eager and up for the challenge. It's been brilliant. So the starting point for this project was engaging a particular user community about a particular problem. And this needs to be done in the context of understanding the science, both in terms of weather and climate and also in mobile phone technology. And that's a two-way iterative process. And understanding the needs of the communities to address real problems requires this multidisciplinary approach that a weather service on its own, whether that's the Met Office or the Uganda Department of Meteorology, is never going to do. The next stage in the process was to strengthen the capacity of the Ugandan Department of Meteorology to forecast. And that's both in terms of technical skills and also in addressing institutional issues, developing a culture for delivery. Finally, we needed to tailor we needed to tailor a product that met the needs of that particular user community. And then we're using new technology, SMS technology, that's just become available in that region to communicate those warnings to end-user fishermen. In this way, we hope we've generated a sustainable weather service that reduces the vulnerability of fishing communities to today's weather hazard. It also, hopefully, helps to prepare them and makes them aware and more resilient of future climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. A really fascinating practical example. It did make me think with some of the other talks going on around Civil Service Live this week. It's a very good example of a behavioural nudge, really, the sort of things that we're thinking of in the UK context. Our final speaker, before we begin a panel discussion, is the Head of Climate Science Advice at the Met Office, Vicky Pope. Vicky was one of the founders of the Hadley Centre, which is one of the leading centres on climate science in the world, one of three, and is therefore one of the really influential voices today in the international discussions on climate change. So, Vicky, thank you.
Before I start, just in case anybody's confused, I should mention that the Hadley Centre is part of the Met Office. It is actually the Climate Research Department of the Met Office. Just in case people have been mentioning Met Office and Hadley Centre, and that people may think we're talking about two different organisations, but we're not. And now I'd really like to put the work that we're doing on making climate change information relevant to developing countries in the context of what's being done internationally. So, this is very much an international effort. The World Meteorological Organization has established a global framework for climate services, and this was established at an international meeting in 2009. And it's really to strengthen the production, availability, delivery, and application of science-based climate prediction and services. So it's very much the meteorological community's response, but working with other organisations in the sort of way that Tom and Ivan have talked about, that we need to build climate change thinking into all future planning, really, particularly where, people are vulnerable already to the weather and the current climate. They're going to be potentially even more vulnerable in the future. And we need sound evidence to base those sorts of decisions on. And one aspect that they mentioned, which is going to feed through to the rest of my talk really, is that the most important feature of the framework should be the close interaction between users and providers of climate information and products, so that it's not enough for the weather community to just, and the climate community just to put out information and expect people to know what to do with it. We've actually got to work with the user community to make that happen. And the project that Ivan talked about, the Climate Science Research Partnership, is an excellent example of that, and I'll give some more details about that at the end of my talk. I just wanted to say what the Met Office view really is of what a typical climate service looks like from our perspective. And the CSRP is a very good example of this. So one aspect, so you've got a sort of thread of science through to products in the middle, and then on the sides it's how we interact with people and how we get information and provide information. So obviously we have to improve our understanding of climate and climate change. We need to improve data, we need to improve the modelling. I'll give some examples of that in a minute. We need to, so sort of basic tools of the trade, if you like. We need to improve our prediction products. Downscaling simply means, we have these big global models that tell you what's going to happen on a 150-kilometre scale. But you also need detailed information. So if your country has lots of mountains, for example, then there's a lot of detail that we can give in addition to that. So people are very interested in that. It also provides tools that people can use for doing their own climate modelling. So even if you can't afford, like the Met Office, to run a great big global climate model, anybody can run a regional model on a PC, and we can train them how to do that. Monitoring and attribution, that's really looking at the data and actually putting it into a form where it's sort of, it tells us about what climate is doing. What you don't want to do is to be measuring a sudden change in temperature just because your measurement technique has changed. You've got to make sure that your measurements are all consistent, and that's how you do the monitoring. And attribution is the link between cause and effect. So we have to say, well, we see this change in climate. What does it mean? If we see a big weather event like the flooding in Pakistan, is that due to climate change? Well, no, it's a freak weather event. Could it be more common in the future? Well, yes, it could be, because climate change means that extreme events could be more common. And then we need to provide products in a useful form for people to use. So the other aspect of this, going up and down each side, is the consultation process, making sure we understand what people's requirements are and work with them to produce those, and then to integrate that into their solutions. And also doing the type of thing that Tom talked about and Ivan talked about, actually building capacity within some of these countries where they only have a kind of fledgling scientific community to help them to grow their science. They can answer some of the questions for themselves, sometimes in partnership with us, and sometimes actually going off on their own and doing it. So that's knowledge management for scientists, but then beyond that, of course, we then have to find ways of engaging with the user community, the policy community, to make sure that they're using the information as well. I just wanted to give some examples of these projects. There's one, I can't remember what ACRE stands for, but essentially it's an analysis project. You'd think that all the data in the world would be digitized and we'd be able to access it and tell us what the climate is doing, but there are many countries in the world and many aspects of the data that actually aren't digitized yet. Some of it is on bits of paper. I've got a colleague who's got some of it in his garage. It's very expensive to image that data and then digitize it. Other data is kept by military organizations, and they have to be persuaded that maybe it doesn't have military value anymore, but it's really important that people know about this. Chile was a very good example. There's virtually no data the scientists had. This project has been able to release that data, so the scientists in Chile are now able to analyze it. There's a project called Old Weather, which you can contribute to yourselves, actually, where data's been, it's been photographed from pieces of paper, and people need to type it in, basically, to create digitized data, and anybody can participate in that. So, if you're willing to help, that would be great. So it's all of those things, and then they have big reanalysis projects to try and pull all that data together and make it available to people. So getting that out to the community, to anybody who needs to use it. For prediction, we talked about the Climate Science Research Partnership. That's actually the Met Office flagship program in this area. So that's sort of the big project that we have. But we have a number of other programs on a smaller scale that working with different countries. For example, we have a project in Bangladesh, and I believe there's some brochures down here you can pick up afterwards, building capacity to help people use our regional modelling. So we have this model that can run for any region of the world, And they're running it over the Bangladesh region and surrounding countries. And they can then look at the impacts of climate change from that model. We're also developing tools that people can use to get add-on information, so things like a sea level tool to look at sea level rise, ways of visualizing that. And you know, in some of these capacity building projects, we also help people to produce their national adaptation plans. So that's just some examples. A sort of tool that's being developed, it's actually quite a big project to help us to do this, is the Open Platform, which is a joint program between the Met Office, the Technology Strategy Board, and IBM. And it's more than, you know, it's not just a server where you can plonk your data. It's actually about making sure there's information about the data, what its quality is, where it's come from. It's a way of sharing modeling tools. So it's a way of people who want to work together, of sharing information and sharing tools, and actually encouraging that working together, and also about putting data out there so people can develop new applications and maybe sell those on. So it's something that could be very useful, I think, in developing countries where perhaps they don't have the capacity, they don't have the computing facility. They can still participate in that international activity. A number of organisations are starting to get interested in this, and it's still, you know, very embryonic, but it has huge potential. I just wanted to leave with one example, and that was to look at the Climate Science Research Partnership again, and Ivan illustrated some of the science that's been done within the Met Office Hadley Centre. But one of the major components of this project, which I think Ivan particularly has pushed on us, which we hadn't done before, and we haven't done enough before, and we really value this actually, and I think we'll use it much more in the future, is to actually do a consultation before we start doing the project. So rather than coming up with a solution and then saying, where's the problem we need to solve, we're actually saying, what is the problem you want us to solve, and really focusing on that. And there were 52 interviews in 8 African countries, and you can see here all the different types of organisations that were involved that we talked to. A lot of them were meteorological climate scientists within those countries, but also agriculture, water resources, education, all of these things. And what they've came up with was that they have an immediate need for improved monthly to seasonal predictions. They need to know when the rains are going to come, and how, you know. And so their highest priority is the timing of the seasonal rainfall. And Ivan mentioned that we've produced a new product already for West Africa. And then they're also interested in multi-annual decadal predictions. So they're needing information on adaptation, not necessarily a century ahead, but more, you know, in the next decade or so. Actually, it's easier for us to produce something a century ahead because the changes are bigger, but these are the sorts of challenges. So we were aware that these were the types of issues that they would want to look at, but this would really actually highlighted what we need to focus on, and that's where the research is focusing now as we speak. And I'll leave that up for questions.
Thank you, Vicky. Okay, we've had 4 talks, lots of information, some quite practical examples of how this science is being applied to the issue of climate change in the developing world. I'm sure we've got quite a lot of questions, and what we'd like to do is spend the next 15 minutes or so on questions. What I'd like, ideally, would be to take 2 or 3 maybe at a time so that we can get the most out of the panel. So if you'd like to raise your hand if you've got a question, say where you're from, who you are, what your question is, and we will try and answer them. So we've got one over there. Any others? It's quite difficult to see. Have we got any others at the moment? Okay, well, we'll start with you, sir. There. Thank you.
Just checking this is working. Yes. Thank you very much. Fascinating. And my name's Mike Bob Stein from the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. And I'm really encouraged to see all the work that's happening in the developing countries. But it's, first of all, in terms of looking at the threat to the planet from climate change, is all this work going to be effective in arresting it, or is this just tokenism? And I suppose my second concern is that although there's really good work that's been done in the developing world, how effective are you in changing attitudes in the developed countries, such as the UK, where there's a lot of widespread skepticism about climate change, and so we still have problems like people building homes on floodplains and local authorities no longer being required to provide data on the effectiveness of their transport policies.
Okay, thank you. So Mike has asked two questions. One is about, will it work and will it arrest climate change? So it's sort of a question of mitigation versus adaptation. And I don't know whether Nafis would like to kick off on that, would you? And then the second part is, how effective is it in changing attitudes? That might be one, I don't know, for you, Vicky, but do you want to start us off?
Yes, of course. The examples that you saw today were mostly about enabling developing countries and communities within those countries cope with variability in the weather. So in that sense, they're very valuable and very useful. There's a separate issue about long-term climate change and what kind of mitigation actions need to be taken. And as you will know, there's a process that's ongoing through the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, about negotiating limits and negotiating reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, anyone who's been following the story will know that there's now universal, and I have to say there are some individual scientists who aren't necessarily climate scientists who disagree with the consensus, but there's an almost universal consensus amongst climate scientists that climate change is happening, the evidence is unequivocal, and that consensus has been reflected in the IPCC recommendations. Now, the IPCC is an intergovernmental panel, and that means it's not a conglomeration just of scientists. It's every government in the world coming together and saying, yes, we think that this is a real issue. So there is also, and this is sometimes overlooked, an international governmental level consensus that this is a major issue. Now, having come to that view, the next stage is what action do we have to take? Everyone recognizes the problem. Now that's when it gets a little bit more difficult, and there is a process of negotiation going on. As I said in my short presentation, Cancun, I think, was a relative success. It was more modest in its ambition at the start to start with. Nonetheless, there are some concrete measures that have been agreed which will help with mitigation. Whether we're able to keep emissions reductions and get that rapid reduction that we need to keep to 2 degrees is a moot point. It's an open question, but certainly it's the intention of this government and many governments around the world to do that.
Thank you, Nafis. And the second part of the question was about changing behaviours, and we know from quite a lot of evidence that actually, if anything, people are less concerned about climate change than they were even a year or two ago on some surveys, despite the science. Who wants to take that one? Vicky?
Yeah, I think Ivan wanted to say something as well afterwards. But just on that question, actually, I was at a party at the weekend and somebody said to me, oh, I can see the climate is changing, but, isn't it all natural? And that's something that I get, when I say what my job is, that's what people say to me all the time. Now, it's interesting because 5 years ago they didn't say that, but actually they didn't ask me about it very much. And I think that actually it was at the back of their minds, but they felt that they couldn't say it. And I think that some of the things that have happened in the last few years with the UEA emails, for example, and some of the discussion around and the scepticism that's coming out in the media has made people feel that they can actually put the questions that they perhaps had anyway, that they can bring those to the fore. I know when you do surveys, you do see a change in attitudes as well, but I think people do have genuine questions about these things. And whenever there's a weather event, we always tell them it's not climate change, because you can't say an individual event is climate change. All you can say is that certain events have become more likely, so heat waves. The heat wave like 2003 is already twice as likely, possibly 4 times as likely, but that's not a direct cause and effect, it's a probability, and that's quite hard for people to grasp. So in the Met Office, we've thought about this quite a bit, about how to engage people in the conversation in a better way about the science, and help people to understand how science works, I think, is part of it. But really, what we're focusing on is actually getting the information about observations out there to people. So I think this project that I mentioned about old weather, where people can actually get involved in analysing the data themselves, for people who are interested in data, actually is quite helpful. And that type of thing, helping people to understand those observations of the climate and what's natural and what's man-made and how these things interact with each other. And also just some basics about this climate science. So we're in the middle of producing a poster at the moment, which we hope to, we haven't quite decided how to issue it yet, but that just with the basics of climate science, how climate works, how the weather works, how it all fits together, what different parts of the world, how their climates vary. So the sorts of things that people learnt at school but forgot about or missed out on at school and they should have learnt, their children probably know more about it, because that's a building block that we need to help people understand. But I also think it's about encouraging people to ask the questions that the genuine questions that they have, and not saying, it's all done and dusted. The science is, all done and dusted, but there's an equal problem in making sure we communicate that and have a discussion about that. So,
Ivan, did you want to?
Yes, I wanted to perhaps certainly come to the first question, tokenism. I don't think that this is tokenism. The amount of resources and the effort that we currently dedicating to this is actually very, very significant. I've been engaged on international development on the kind of environment side of things, and up to about 2 years ago, nobody was really worried about the environment. 2 years ago, things have changed dramatically. First of all, climate change is now one of 6 pillars in our international development program. So it's one of the 6 important pillars. Secondly, the international system is aiming to provide about $100 billion, and I had a mistake on my slide, I realized later on, $100 billion of assistance to developing countries by 2020. And just to put this in perspective, this is about the same amount as the total overseas development assistance from all rich countries to developing countries today. So just to give you the size of what we have in mind. And thirdly, of course, we're not only interested in this kind of effort that we're currently supporting on the science side. 50% of the funding that we're intending to provide to support this during this government is dedicated to a whole range of adaptation actions, 30% to moving developing countries towards low carbon development, and that involves some very significant investments in very modern technology, and also 20% is on carbon sequestration through better forest management. So tokenism, not sure. This is a very, very significant shift that I've seen in our move to international development. Now, is this going to make a change? Are we going to change attitudes in rich countries? I think this is a key question. It's one that we ask ourselves in the Department for International Development a lot. Should our effort in international development be aimed more at the way in which we behave rather than in assisting developing countries? It's an open question, but which we certainly are asking for the moment. One of the things that we observe is that the private sector is shifting, and we're not always aware of that, but the private sector is investing quite heavily in alternative sources of energy, not as much because of the climate change agenda, but because of 2 other reasons. One of which is that there's a hell of a lot of money to be made out of the alternative energy market, and nothing like the private sector to sniff out a good deal somewhere. And secondly, they're aware that there is another agenda out there, which Nafis talked about, and that is that energy, or cheap oil-based energy, is becoming rarer and rarer. And so there is quite an incentive for the private sector to invest. So I'm not necessarily that desperate.
Thank you, that's encouraging. Some more, so we've got one there, and one over there, and one here. So that's 3, and I will look out for perhaps one more. Well, that might be our last round, but let's see. So,
hi, is that working? I'm Claire Hardgrave from the Home Office. I'm really interested in how we can apply kind of weather science in our home government departments. The DFID example is really interesting, but sort of concerned me a bit because you seem very specialised and have a lot of scientific knowledge. My particular example is I work on refugee movements. So how do I plan for the future and understand how changing weather patterns will affect refugee movements across the world, and how do we build that into our planning and our modelling informing our projections for the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. Let's just take the three together. Yes.
I'm a journalist. I'm an outsider. My apologies. Also, my apologies for the mess that we journalists made of climate change in the last 18 months. One of the problems is that 30 years ago, we began to use PCs as typewriters, and PCs have actually changed the nature of efficient communicating. Efficient communicating with PCs should put new information together so that all journalists can be well informed by the available information every time they write an article about climate change. Now, to do that, the information only has to be put together, and we have a business plan for achieving that, and I want to know who to talk to at the Met Office.
Excellent. Good. A very specific question there, gentlemen. Thank you. And one over here.
Hiya, my name is Sarah Traubel. I'm currently interning at the Department for Education. I have one question relating to some of the data you gave us. Basically, there are some regions that are going to experience more floods, but other regions that are going to experience a huge sequence of droughts. Does that mean, does that mean that the yields on their harvests will be lower, therefore they can't nourish their population like we see in Somalia right now? Will that mean that these regions will not be livable in the future, or what are the kind of measures they need to take in terms of how to sustain agriculture?
Good, thank you. So three very interesting questions, a range of questions. So we've got Claire from the Home Office on the application of science, and thinking particularly of refugee movements, and we can be pretty confident that this is going to be one of the powerful push factors in terms of perhaps very large movements of people around the world. So that's one question. The gentleman at the front on the, I suppose it was the original conception of the internet, wasn't it? Using computers in this way, but okay, so okay, so it's a question about using PCs in terms of dissemination of information, and thirdly, impact of climate change on food yields and for habitable areas, fundamentally. So, any volunteers? Tom?
I'm going to take the first one, if that's all right, because I think that's something that I can talk about. There is some work that is starting, and I'm not sure whether the Home Office has been involved, on climate security, because obviously, and this is cross-governmental actually, because and being led, the Met Office is very much involved, but being led by the Foreign Office. Yeah, absolutely, because there's a range of issues around climate and security, and one of those is about movement of people in drought, and which we're already seeing. I mean, East Africa, and we've probably seen it for quite some time. There's also the issue of conflicts that could be attributed to climate change, and there's quite a lot of discussion over Darfur and some of the issues there that are, in a lot of cases, a changing climate will exacerbate problems that already exist and create bigger tensions which eventually have to give somewhere. So what I'd ask you to do is come and give me your details, and I'll make sure that I put you in contact with the right person to discuss the climate security aspects that are going on at the moment.
Good. Thank you, Tom.
I would like to take the third question, if you don't mind, from the lady from the Department of Education. You had two questions, one which relates to the impact of climate change on crop yields. This is a fairly mixed picture, really, but on the whole, there is a general worry that that climate change will, in the long run, have a negative impact on the yields, especially of rain-fed crops, in a large amount of developing countries. And the main worry is around Southern Africa, especially the yields of maize in Southern Africa, and also the yields of rice in South Asia. Now, this is an area which still is beset by huge amounts of uncertainty. There have been some reports very, very recently reported in the New Scientist from very credible research done on the basis of statistical analysis on large data sets, which stands to confirm this. We are supporting a large program led by a team in Columbia University, but involving global teams of researchers to try and get to the bottom of this by applying some, if you want, by applying the modeling science on the next step. So not only on this on the climate science, but on the crop production science. And we hope that we will have a much better estimate of exactly which crops are most at risk and where they are most at risk by the time of the next report of the International Panel for Climate Change, which is due to come out in 2013-14. Yeah. So that's the first thing. Now the second one about regions that might not become habitable anymore. This is again an area where there is a lot of contestation. But what is certain is that places where it is already very hard to live, that are currently not very habitable, are likely to become even less habitable. And this is particularly the case for two situations. One is the semi-arid regions and the arid regions, as we currently see, for instance, in the Horn of Africa, certainly in the eastern part of it, people who are already at the margins of survival because they really have been pushed into an area which is already not very habitable, they are quite likely to suffer more. Now, what we observe when we do simulations of the future in there is that the main reason why we expect more trouble in the future is not as much because of the climate becoming worse, but because of population densities becoming much higher in the much more risky places. So this applies particularly in semi-arid areas, but it also applies in areas where you have high density populations in river basins and river deltas which flood very regularly. This is, for instance, a situation in South Asia, especially in the Bay of Bengal, Bangladesh, and the parts of India that are affected by that as well. But again, those people who are most at risk are the ones who are already being pushed for one or another reason into places that actually they should never live anyway. So the parts of Bangladesh that are most at risk are people who live on sandbanks along rivers, because there is no other land available for them for a number of reasons, and they're the ones who are likely to move. And I'm sure that Nafis is going to build on some of that in response to the first question.
Yeah, well, I will. The issue of crop productivity is not a simple one, because it's not the case that climate will change and society will not respond with different kinds of technologies for production of food crops. So, for example, there may be GM crops, there may be different breeding programs to develop saline-resistant crops. A whole host of technological responses you can do and social responses you can do. One of the issues in Africa is, for example, current irrigation techniques that are used in developed countries could be transferred to the African situation, and you would get a huge increase in productivity. So I would caution against a kind of simple cause and effect relation between climate change and decrease in crop productivity. There was a report last year by the government chief scientific advisor Foresight one on agricultural production and climate change, which addressed some of these issues, but it's not a simple story, and that's my main point. It's also complicated by the fact that the analysis that we're doing in the department on energy shows that we're going to, if we want to achieve this 80% reduction by 2050, we're going to rely quite a lot on biomass and biofuels. Now, one of the things that we're trying to do is address where is that going to come from. No doubt other developed countries are in the same boat, i.e. they're looking at where they should get their biofuels and biomass from. What we don't want to happen is that to impinge on food production given the uncertainty. So that's a very much a live issue that we're trying to address. If I could just address the question about, gentlemen, about the PCs and internet and information. I don't think it is a question of information deficit. There's plenty of information out there. So just giving journalists more information, I don't think will not solve the problem. One of the things that we have to recognise is that there is quite a lot of uncertainty in climate projections and understanding what the future will be like, because a lot of these are conditional statements. If we didn't change, this would happen, or if we changed by this amount, that would happen. Those are the kinds of projections that we make. So there's a big margin of uncertainty about what the future will be like. But given that uncertainty, the sensible thing one would think to do is try to reduce the risk, and that's the perspective, and that's the kind of argument that we haven't been as successful as we could have, or as we should be, in getting across both to the general public and to various other influential people and decision makers. And I think a lot more effort needs to be made in making that argument very clearly. Our Secretary of State last week gave, I thought, was a really, really useful speech setting out some of the arguments. He's going to do a series of 3 speeches restating what the arguments are for having to change, and it's about having to change. Did you want to
I was just going to add to a couple of those, actually. Firstly, on the PC question again, I think one of the issues when dealing with journalists that we find is that we want to give an objective view of the science and explain what the science says and make sure that we're accurate. And the journalist has to sell the newspaper. And those two things are not compatible. And we do package up our information in ways that tell a story, which is what they need, and look at whether this story is going to be interesting to other people and try to put things out that will be of interest whilst maintaining that scientific integrity and objectivity. But it's a constant tension. And there are lots of we have lots of information on our website. There are lots of ways that people can get information in useful forms. IPCC do it as well. They have a very good Q&A section actually at the back of the report. Actually, one of the best ones that I've seen. Some of the other bits of the report are quite difficult to read, but the Q&A section is actually very good. So there are lots of things there, and actually quite good tools out there. But I think it's maintaining that dialogue between the interested parties and journalists and so on, and making sure that they are as objective as is possible, given the fact that they still need to sell a newspaper. The other point I just wanted to make was coming back to the first question about refugee movements. We are indeed involved in a number of projects looking at climate change and security, and but one thing that all of the things that we've talked about today is about building resilience to current climate and climate change. So it's about not just throwing your hands up and saying, oh, everything's going to be a disaster, there are going to be lots of refugees, but saying, how can we build resilience into these communities and making sure that it's climate proofed. So making sure that when we build something that's resilient today, it's still going to be resilient in 50 years' time if it's going to be around in 50 years' time. So.
Thank you, Vicky. Time is bearing down on us, but I'm conscious there might be just one burning question somebody's got that they really wanted to ask. So, is there one final question? If not... At the back. It's so hard to see at the back. Thank you. You've just got in. Well done. And we'll have to make this our last question. And there is a microphone coming to you.
Carol Burry, Ministry of Justice. Considering the reported attitudes of America, Russia, China, and how much bigger they are than us, what can I say to family and friends to convince them that them putting their empty Coke bottle in the green bin really does make a difference?
What a superb question to finish on. It's the sort of I will if you will conundrum, isn't it?
What was the...
So the question is, given that this is an international problem and there are a number of countries with sort of very different views on how to tackle climate change, and we know that there are disagreements between China and the US and other countries, actually what can an individual citizen do, I suppose? And almost is it worth us taking action as individuals? I hope I've captured
Exactly.
that.
Yeah. This is something that my department is very much exercised about, this particular question of what people do and what people do individually and collectively. Individually, being aware of your carbon footprint is quite important. If you look at how much greenhouse gas emissions are a result of a per capita in a developed country, it is huge compared with, say, someone living in India or sub-Saharan Africa, or even in China, although China's fast catching up. And there are lots of things that one could do as an individual. We've got a number of policies that we're introducing or have introduced about reducing emissions through energy-saving measures, for example. So insulating your home efficiently is one very effective way of reducing your emissions. I should say that it's interesting, although in China, Russia, the US and India, people, politically it seems that there's not a lot of support ostensibly for climate change. When you look at what the governments are doing, and particularly what the militaries are doing, it's interesting because the US Navy, for example, and I was at a conference recently where Arnold Schwarzenegger gave a talk, and he was really, really interesting. I was very impressed, even for a Republican, that he said that the US Navy has become, has developed policy, so it wants to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 25%. This is the US Navy that's doing this. So notwithstanding the formal position of the government in international negotiations, they have very large institutions in the US, similarly in China, similarly in India, who are making very significant steps about reducing emissions.
Thank you, Nafis. And we are going to have to wrap it up there. It's a very good question to end on. I hope that what we've had in the last hour is not just some really good information about the science of climate change and the application of that science in the developing world, but also a sense that although this is complicated, things are happening and we needn't and shouldn't adopt a position of despair. So let's leave this room with a feeling that we can do something as individuals and our governments can. And a big thank you to our panel of Tom, Ivan, and Nafis and Vicky. Thank you very much.